The first thing Commander Zephyr Kincaid noticed upon waking from cryosleep was the smell, which was impressive considering his nose had been frostbitten for the better part of a century. The acrid stench of burnt circuitry mixed with what he was pretty sure was the residue of someone's last regurgitated meal. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Commander," chimed Hallie Pritchard, the ship's communications officer and Kincaid's personal pain in the ass. Her voice was as grating as ever, which meant some things hadn't changed despite the ship's apparent nosedive into the seventh circle of hell. "Glad to be here, Hallie," Kincaid rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper against rusted metal. "Though the stench of burnt popcorn and fierce sweat wasn't quite what I imagined waking up to," Hallie snorted, a sound that once upon a time he might have found endearing. "Well, the Aegis isn't exactly a five-star resort, more like a death trap with a fondness for bad smells." The lights flickered, a not-so-subtle reminder of the Aegis' current status, a once mighty colony ship now reduced to a floating scrapyard. Kincaid stumbled out of his cryopod, nearly tripping over his own feet. The rest of the crew was stirring, each emerging from their icy cocoons like disgruntled butterflies who'd rather crawl back in. "Anyone care to explain why we're orbiting what looks like a giant ball of nothing?" asked Dr. Samuel Connors, the ship's medic and the most perpetually unimpressed man Kincaid had ever met. His penchant for sarcasm was only outmatched by his bedside manner, which was akin to being treated by a slightly irritated crocodile. "That dock is a rogue planet," Kincaid replied, glancing at the viewing screen, "and I'm pretty sure it wasn't on our itinerary." "Must have made a wrong turn at Alpha Centauri," Hallie quipped. "Or maybe the autopilot just decided it wanted a vacation," replied Connors dryly. The ship's AI, an entity they affectionately called George, chose this moment to chime in, its voice the epitome of bureaucratic monotony. "Attention, crew. The Aegis has experienced a navigation malfunction. Current status: orbiting uncharted rogue planet." "No shit, George," Kincaid muttered. "What's next? A reminder to buckle up." "Buckle up," George dutifully responded. Commandeering the bridge, Kincaid attempted to make sense of the chaos. Lights blinked erratically, monitors displayed gibberish, and the once high-tech interface now seemed about as useful as a toaster in a bathtub. "Anyone else feeling like a side character in a disaster movie?" Hallie asked, not really expecting an answer. "I always preferred comedies," Connors said, fiddling with a console that sparked and fizzed like it was auditioning for a pyrotechnics show. "Feels like we're stuck in the punchline," Kincaid grimaced, slapping the side of a monitor. "And speaking of jokes, who wants to bet on the odds of alien stowaways?" As if on cue, the ship's emergency klaxons blared to life, accompanied by George's unflappable announcement. "Alert. Unidentified life forms detected on board." "Called it," Kincaid said, his humor now tinged with a hint of actual concern. "Someone grab a mop and a gun." The crew, now fully awake and about as ready as they'd ever be, armed themselves with a mishmash of whatever weapons the Aegis had left. Blasters, knives, and a particularly menacing-looking wrench that Hallie had taken a liking to. "Hope these aliens are allergic to sarcasm," Connors said, brandishing a blaster with all the enthusiasm of a man about to do his taxes. "If not, we're screwed," Kincaid replied, checking his own blaster for charge. "Let's give him a warm human welcome." The corridors of the Aegis, once pristine and gleaming, now resembled the aftermath of a particularly rowdy frat party. Panels hung askew, wires dangled like drunken snakes, and the floors were littered with debris. The first alien they encountered was, to put it mildly, not what they expected. It looked like a cross between a giant cockroach and a disgruntled accountant, its beady eyes glowering over a mouth that seemed permanently downturned. "Lovely," Hallie said, raising her wrench. "I was just thinking I needed a new pet." "See if it does any tricks," Kincaid suggested, as the alien screeched and lunged forward. The ensuing scuffle was less of a battle and more of an awkward dance. The alien flailed its limbs, knocking over more panels and narrowly missing Hallie's head. Connors shrugged and fired his blaster, the shot singeing the creature's exoskeleton and causing it to retreat with a shriek that could probably shatter glass. "Well, that's one way to make friends," Connors said, as the alien scuttled away, leaving a trail of slime that would have made a slug blush. "Don't think it's the type to exchange friendship bracelets," Kincaid said, wiping alien goo off his boot. "George, any more surprises?" "Lifeform count 6, George responded with all the enthusiasm of a funeral director. "Great," Kincaid muttered. "We've got a damn family reunion on board. Let's hope they brought snacks." The crew split, each taking different corridors, the ship's layout a labyrinth of confusion and potential death. Hallie and Connors moved toward the cargo bay, where George claimed more aliens were nesting. Kincaid took the maintenance shaft, his path lit by the flickering emergency lights, which seemed to enjoy turning off at the most inconvenient moments. "This place would give a haunted house a run for its money," he muttered, crawling through the cramped space. The ship groaned, metal and machinery complaining like an old man with a bad back. Kincaid reached the end of the shaft, kicking open the hatch with all the grace of a bull in a china shop. What he saw made him wish for the good old days of cryosleep. 2 more aliens, these resembling oversized lobsters with attitudes to match, were rummaging through the maintenance supplies, making a mess that would have given Kincaid's mother a heart attack. "Hey," he shouted, raising his blaster. "I don't care if you're here for the intergalactic buffet." "This isn't self-serve." The aliens turned, pincers snapping in a way that suggested they'd gotten the aggressive part of the human-alien interaction manual down pat. Kincaid fired, the blaster's charge lighting up the dim compartment like a Christmas tree on caffeine. One alien dropped, its shell smoking as it twitched its last. The other decided diplomacy was the better part of valor and skittered away, leaving Kincaid with a mess and a blistering headache. "You'd think they'd at least leave us a note," he grumbled, wiping his brow. "Or a Yelp review." Linking up with the rest of the crew, Kincaid found Hallie and Connors had been busy. 2 more aliens lay sprawled in the cargo bay, their carapaces charred and their dignity, if they'd had any, thoroughly trampled. "Looks like the welcome committee did its job," Hallie said, leaning on her wrench. "We're gonna need a bigger spray bottle," Connors muttered. "And a hell of a lot more air freshener," Kincaid replied. "George, status report. Unidentified lifeforms remaining 2. "Well," Kincaid said, turning to his crew with a grim smile, "looks like we've got a couple more party crashers to deal with." "Can't wait," Hallie replied, sarcasm dripping from her words like venom. "This day just keeps getting better," Connors snorted. "Let's get this over with then." "Got a feeling we're just getting started." As they moved through the dim corridors, a sense of camaraderie settled over the crew, a shared acknowledgement that if they were going to survive this mess, they'd have to rely on each other and their gallows humor. "Hey, Kincaid," Hallie called as they rounded a corner. "Ever think about taking a vacation from all this?" "Every damn day," Kincaid replied, shaking his head. "But something tells me the beaches on this rogue planet could use a little more sun." The crew chuckled, the sound echoing through the ship as they prepared to face whatever other surprises the universe might throw at them. Because if there was one thing the crew of the Aegis knew, it was that surviving was just the start of the fun. "Power's out, aliens are in, and we're orbiting a giant rock with no personality," Kincaid announced, trying to rally what little optimism he had left. He aimed for inspiring leader, but it came out more like a disgruntled tour guide who just realized the bus had no wheels. "Sounds like a normal Tuesday," Hallie said, thumping the wrench against her palm with enough enthusiasm to suggest she was contemplating a career change to gladiator. "George, how's the ship looking?" Kincaid asked, as they made their way back to the bridge, stepping over cables and the occasional piece of alien detritus. "Current status: operational with compromised systems. Power fluctuations detected. Secondary systems offline. Would you like a more detailed report?" George's monotony was almost comforting in the chaos. "About as much as I'd like a root canal," Kincaid replied. "Understood. Canceling report," George said, as if he'd been planning an entire PowerPoint presentation. "So, these aliens," Connors began, wringing his hands like he was about to deliver a eulogy. "You think they're here to throw us a surprise party or more of a hostile takeover? Considering they skipped the welcome to the neighborhood gift basket, I'm betting on the latter," Hallie quipped, kicking a dislodged panel back into place. Kincaid nodded, staring at the viewing screen that displayed a rather unflattering image of the rogue planet. "We need to figure out what the hell they want and make sure they don't get it. Assuming they aren't just here for the ambience," Connors said, inserting a bit of sarcasm into the air like a doctor with a hypodermic needle full of disdain. As the trio settled into the bridge, Kincaid took stock of the situation. Lights flickered, and the occasional spark flew from an overworked console, lending the space a kind of hellish atmosphere that was both unsettling and familiar. It was like a bad memory you couldn't shake, but with more chances of dying horribly. "All right, let's see if we can make contact with our guests," Kincaid said, rubbing his temples. "Hallie, get on the comms. Maybe they speak sarcasm. And if they don't, well, we're screwed anyway." Hallie plopped herself in front of the comms console, her fingers dancing over the keys with the kind of dexterity that spoke of long nights spent hacking into systems that weren't exactly public domain. The speakers crackled, emitting a sound that was somewhere between nails on a chalkboard and a cat having a bad day. "Virax, if you're out there, you've got a lot of explaining to do," Hallie said into the mic, her tone as friendly as a cactus. "This is the Aegis, and we prefer our ship uninvaded, thank you very much." The response was immediate, a garble of clicks and hisses that sounded like someone had thrown a bag of marbles into a blender. Kincaid frowned, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "Anyone fluent in alien static?" "Not unless it's the kind that comes with subtitles," Connors replied, his face a mask of feigned interest. "George, any chance you can translate that?" Kincaid asked, knowing full well the answer would probably just annoy him. "Translation subsystem offline. Attempting to analyze patterns," George replied, as helpful as an umbrella in a hurricane. "Great," Kincaid muttered, pacing the bridge like a caged animal. "We're stuck playing charades with aliens who might want to turn us into a meat platter." "Well, when you put it like that," Hallie said, rolling her eyes, "it sounds positively delightful." Before Kincaid could respond, the ship's lights flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness. "Perfect timing," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Nothing like a little ambience to set the mood." As the power returned, George spoke up again. "Analysis complete. Communication indicates territorial claim. Species identified as Virax. Recommendation: negotiate or eliminate threat." "Negotiate or eliminate, huh?" Kincaid echoed, running a hand through his hair. "Those are some delightful options. Any chance we could try offer them cookies instead?" "If we had any cookies, maybe," Connors said, his voice a low rumble. "But since we're fresh out of baked goods, I suggest we focus on not getting dismembered." "Good call, Doc," Kincaid replied. "Hallie, see if you can establish a video link. Maybe if we can see them, we can figure out what they want." Hallie nodded, typing furiously until a new image flickered on the viewing screen. The alien on the other side was as charming as a gargoyle at a family reunion, its chitinous face twisted into an expression that was probably meant to be serious, but came across more like a kid trying to impersonate their angry parent. "Look at that face," Hallie said, squinting at the screen. "Bet it could stop a clock." "Or several," Connors muttered, leaning in for a closer look. "Virax representative, this is Commander Zephyr Kincaid of the Aegis," Kincaid said, attempting diplomacy for the first time since his academy days. "Your presence on our vessel is unexpected." The Virax made a sound like a rusty hinge being opened and closed repeatedly, then spoke in a guttural language that was both fascinating and headache-inducing. "George, translate that," Kincaid ordered, hoping the ship's AI would be more useful than a brick in a bag of hammers. Translation: this vessel is now property of the Virax Collective. Vacate or face extermination, George replied, as chipper as ever. Just what I needed, Kincaid muttered, rubbing the bridge of his nose. A hostile eviction notice, Hallie snorted. Charming folks, these Virax. Think they come with a money-back guarantee. Only if we're lucky, Connors said. And since when have we ever been that? Kincaid sighed, considering their options. All right, let's try a different approach. Hallie sent a message back. Tell them we're willing to negotiate but not to surrender. You sure about that? Hallie asked, her fingers poised over the keys. They don't look like the negotiating type. Pretty sure, Kincaid replied, a wry smile tugging at his lips. After all, we're human, we're stubborn. Hallie sent the message and the Virax's response was immediate. Another garbled reply, this time with more emphasis on the hissing, as if they were trying to convey a particularly scathing insult. Translation: negotiation possible. Terms: surrender of vessel, immediate evacuation, or assimilation into Virax hierarchy, George reported, almost sounding like he was relaying an invitation to a particularly exclusive party. Assimilation. Sounds like a great time, Connors said, his tone dripping with irony. Think they'd let us bring party favors? Probably not, Kincaid replied, steeling himself for what was sure to be a less than pleasant conversation. All right, let's take a vote. Who's up for trying to reason with them? Depends on the definition of reason, Hallie said, raising her hand with a grin that suggested she was mostly joking. Connors shrugged, crossing his arms. I've got nothing better to do. Besides, maybe they'll appreciate a good laugh. All right, Kincaid said, nodding. Let's give it a shot. Worst case, we end up in some intergalactic reality show. Taking a deep breath, Kincaid addressed the Virax again. Virax representative, we acknowledge your claim but wish to discuss a peaceful resolution. We offer dialogue and an exchange of information. The alien's response was another chorus of clicks and screeches, this time with an undertone that suggested they were either amused or annoyed, or possibly both. Translation: acknowledged. We will accept dialogue. Prepare to receive Virax envoy, George announced, sounding almost smug. An envoy? This should be good, Hallie said, leaning back in her chair. Think they'll come bearing gifts? Only if you count threats as gifts, Connors replied. Kincaid stood, smoothing his uniform as best he could. All right, let's get ready to meet our guests, and try to play nice at least until we know what we're dealing with. The crew made their way to the docking bay, the ship's halls eerily silent except for the distant hum of machinery and the occasional groan of stressed metal. As they waited, Kincaid couldn't help but feel a twinge of apprehension, like the moment before opening a mystery present that might just explode. The airlock hissed open, and the Virax envoy stepped through, its insectoid form imposing and oddly graceful. It regarded them with an air of superiority, as if it were a king sizing up a group of particularly unimpressive jesters. Great, just what we needed, Hallie whispered to Kincaid. An alien with delusions of grandeur. Welcome aboard the Aegis, Kincaid said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Let's see if we can't find a solution that keeps everyone happy. The Virax made a series of noises that George dutifully translated. We are here to negotiate terms. We require control of this vessel and all relevant data. Control, huh? Kincaid replied, crossing his arms. And what do we get in return? A pat on the back and a thanks for all the fish. Humans may remain as part of the Virax collective. Ensure survival, George translated, the words lacking any real comfort. Join you, huh? Hallie said, her voice dripping with skepticism. Would we get matching uniforms too? The Virax envoy clicked a response, its expression inscrutable. Uniforms not required. Integration ensures stability. Kincaid sighed, shooting a glance at his crew. Look, we're open to talking, but surrendering our ship isn't on the table. We need something more palatable. The Virax emitted a noise that might have been laughter if aliens did such a thing. Alternative: provide information on human technology. Assist Virax efforts. Assist how exactly? Connors asked, his eyes narrowing. As tech support or test subjects, cooperation will be rewarded, George translated, leaving the rest ominously vague. Great talk, Kincaid said, feeling the situation slipping through his fingers like sand. Let's take a break, yeah. We need to confer amongst ourselves. The Virax envoy nodded, their movements strangely fluid for something that looked like it had crawled out of a nightmare. Human time to consider. We await response. With that, the envoy retreated, leaving Kincaid and his crew to mull over their not-so-stellar options. So, Kincaid said, rubbing his hands together, any brilliant ideas? Not unless you count running and screaming as a plan, Hallie said, biting her lip. Connors sighed, sitting heavily on a nearby crate. We're in a tight spot, no doubt, but maybe there's a way to give them something without losing everything. Like a compromise, Kincaid asked, tilting his head. Exactly, Connors said. We give them enough to keep them off our backs, but we hold onto the ship and our lives. Nice theory, Hallie said, crossing her arms, but how do we sell it? Kincaid nodded slowly, contemplating the possibilities. We need leverage, something they want that we can afford to lose. The crew sat in contemplative silence, the weight of their predicament hanging over them like a particularly moody storm cloud. They would have to be smart and, more importantly, just desperate enough to make it work. One thing's for sure, Kincaid said, breaking the silence. We're not going down without a fight, even if it means bluffing our way through. Here's to hoping they fall for it, Hallie said, raising an imaginary glass. As they prepared for the next round of negotiations, Kincaid couldn't help but wonder just how far out on a limb they'd have to go to keep themselves, and the Aegis, from falling into the Virax's grasp. But if there was one thing humans knew how to do, it was adapt. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to see them through this mess. Kincaid paced the bridge like a caged tiger, if that tiger had been raised on caffeine and sarcasm. The Aegis was about as stable as a two-legged stool, and he was starting to get a headache from the flickering lights. It was like being trapped in a cheap disco with someone who had a vendetta against coherent lighting. Any updates on our new best friends? Kincaid asked, turning to George, who was somehow managing to maintain an air of indifference despite the chaos. Virax envoy remains aboard. They are. Perusing the facilities, George said, his voice as monotonous as a broken record. Great, just what we need, aliens on a sightseeing tour, Hallie chimed in, her voice as sharp as a knife. Maybe they'll take a liking to the leaky pipes in Sector 7. Or the charming way the engine room smells like burnt toast, Connors added, inspecting his fingernails with disinterest. Let's not knock our unique ambience, Kincaid said dryly. Maybe it'll convince them to leave before the place falls apart. As if on cue, the lights dimmed further and a series of ominous clanks echoed through the ship. It was the kind of sound that usually preceded a massive repair bill or at least a stern talking to from engineering. That's not encouraging, Connors noted, glancing upward as if expecting the ceiling to cave in. Think it's the autopilot again. Either that or the ship's trying to communicate in Morse code, Kincaid replied, rubbing his temples. Hallie, see if you can patch in a call to engineering. We could use an update before we end up doing an impromptu spacewalk. Hallie nodded and fiddled with her console, which seemed to be held together with equal parts duct tape and wishful thinking. Engineering, this is the bridge. You got anything that might help us not die today? A crackling voice came over the speaker, distorted but recognizable as Sloan, the ship's chief engineer and purveyor of eternal pessimism. Bridge, this is engineering. We're about 2 sparks away from a full blackout. Main powers degrading faster than a politician's promise. Fantastic, Kincaid muttered. Any chance of a fix? Sure, if you got a spare miracle lying around, Sloan retorted. We're cannibalizing non-essentials to keep life support going. Best I can promise is keeping the lights on until something else breaks. Just another day in paradise, Connors said under his breath. Remind me again why we're not just taking the escape pods and running for it. Because they'd probably explode halfway to nowhere, Hallie responded, barely containing a smirk. How heartening, Kincaid said. Thanks for the update, Sloan. Let us know if anything changes. Will do, though I wouldn't hold your breath, Sloane replied before the line went dead with a hiss of static. Turning back to face his crew, Kincaid sighed. All right, options, what do we have? Bribing the VRACs with whatever technology we can spare, Hallie suggested. Might buy us some time. Assuming they don't just decide to take it all anyway, Connors pointed out. We're not exactly in a position to negotiate from strength. True, Kincaid conceded. But we don't have the luxury of being picky. We need to stall them until we can figure something out. Hallie grinned, her enthusiasm for impending doom almost infectious. So, bluffing it is. More like desperate improvisation, Kincaid said. But yeah, close enough. At that moment, George's synthetic voice broke the tension. Incoming communication from VRAC's envoy. They request further discussion in the conference room. Guess they are not into the whole silent contemplation thing, Connors said wryly. Let's go see what they want, Kincaid said, motioning for the others to follow him. And try to think positive. Maybe they'll offer us a timeshare in one of their lovely hive planets. As they made their way to the conference room, Kincaid couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, or at least a really uncomfortable conversation. But he pushed the thought aside. There would be time for paranoia later, assuming they weren't all vaporized first. The conference room was about as inviting as a dentist's waiting area, complete with a flickering holo screen and uncomfortable chairs that squeaked with alarming frequency. The VRAC's envoy was already there, looking like it was contemplating the best way to rearrange their molecular structure. Welcome, Kincaid said, trying to sound less like he was about to throw up. Let's get down to business, shall we? The VRAC's mandibles clicked in what was probably an alien version of rolling one's eyes. We require your decision. Time is a resource humans cannot afford to waste. Well, when you put it like that, Hallie said, leaning back in her chair, we've got an offer. Offer? The envoy's chitinous eyebrows, or what passed for eyebrows, rose in what could have been surprise or mild amusement. Yeah, we're willing to share some of our tech, Kincaid said. Not all of it, mind you, but enough to show our goodwill. It's a win-win, see. The VRACs clicked, its expression as inscrutable as ever. Information exchange is acceptable. Humans will remain under observation during this process. Observation, huh? Connors said, scratching his chin. Let me guess you'll be taking notes or something. Notes and samples, the VRACs corrected, for our archives. Samples, Kincaid repeated, trying not to imagine just what that might entail. And these samples are biological, the VRACs replied matter-of-factly. Ensure proper integration into the VRAC's database. Right, Kincaid said, forcing a smile. Well, we'll need some time to prepare the data. You know how it is, bureaucracy and all. Bureaucracy, the VRACs echoed, tilting its head. Explain. Red tape, Hallie said with a grin. It's like glue, but for paperwork, slows everything down. For efficiency, the VRACs asked, its tone almost hopeful. If only, Connors muttered. The VRACs stared at them for a long moment, probably filing this under weird human behaviors. Very well, we await your preparation. As the envoy left, Kincaid exhaled, tension leaving him like air from a punctured balloon. Well, that went weirdly okay. Yeah, if you don't count the part where they want to keep us as pets, Hallie said, crossing her arms. At least they didn't demand instant compliance, Connors agreed. Small victories, right? Sure, let's call it that, Kincaid said. Now we just need to figure out how to follow through without giving away the farm. Or the livestock, Hallie added with a smirk. All right, back to the drawing board, Kincaid said, ushering his crew out of the conference room. And let's keep this momentum going before the ship decides to take a nap. As they returned to the bridge, Kincaid's mind raced with possibilities, each more tenuous than the last. The Aegis was a creaky, unpredictable beast, but it was the only thing standing between them and the vacuum of space, or worse, life as test subjects. They'd have to be quick, clever, and a little bit lucky. And if the universe had any sense of humor left, maybe, just maybe, they'd pull it off. Kincaid was back on the bridge, running his hand through his hair like he was trying to scrub out the mess they were in. He stared at the flickering lights as if they held the secret to the universe or at least a decent cup of coffee. The V-Racks wanted an exchange, and they wanted samples. Biological ones. Kincaid couldn't shake the image of the V-Racks poking him with probes like he was some kind of intergalactic lab rat. "All right, team," Kincaid said, trying to summon the enthusiasm of a motivational speaker who deeply regretted his career choice. "We need to brainstorm. How do we convince the V-Racks that our bureaucracy is a black hole of inefficiency?" Hallie leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with the air of someone who'd seen this movie before. "We could drown them in paperwork. Confuse them with forms that have forms. Humans love a good form." "Yeah," Connors added, a smirk playing on his lips. "We'll make them fill out a requisition form to get a requisition form. A form for a form," Kincaid mused, the idea taking root. "The V-Racks won't know what hit them." George, who was managing to look both bored and slightly amused, a skill unto itself, raised an eyebrow. "Overload their hierarchical system with our inefficiencies. Bold. Maybe even a little bit brilliant. Or crazy enough to get us all vaporized," Hallie countered, but she didn't sound like she was entirely against the idea. More like she was skeptical in that way a person is when they know they are about to go along with something stupid. "Look," Kincaid said, "the V-Racks operate on strict protocols. What if we use our good old-fashioned human bureaucracy to muck up their system? You know, like a monkey wrench in the works, more like a wrench made of red tape," Connors quipped. "I like it. Let's make the V-Racks regret ever thinking they could out-bureaucrat us. So we drown them in pointless procedures and delays," Hallie said, nodding slowly. "I bet they'll love waiting for processing. We've got to make it look convincing," George pointed out. "They can't think it's a sham." "Leave that to me," Hallie grinned. "I'm practically a professional at making simple things complicated, and I'll draft up some suitably unintelligible documents," Connors offered. "My handwriting's bad enough to challenge the Rosetta Stone." Kincaid felt a glimmer of hope, a rare commodity aboard the Aegis. If he squinted, he could almost see a way out of this mess. "All right, let's get to work. We're going to turn our inefficiency into a weapon." "Ready to put on a show?" Hallie gave a mock salute. "Ready and willing, Commander." George, still the picture of indifference, simply nodded as if this ludicrous plan was just another Wednesday. "Connors, you get started on the bureaucratic nightmare. Hallie, prepare the communications. George, keep an eye on those power fluctuations. Last thing we need is the lights going out mid-bluff." As they dispersed to their tasks, Kincaid couldn't help but feel they were walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. Then again, when wasn't that the case? Life on the Aegis was nothing if not perilously entertaining. With the crew busy at their stations, Kincaid turned his attention back to the V-Racks envoy, who was undoubtedly waiting with the kind of patient malice only an alien could muster. The plan had to work, or the next communication would be a lot less friendly. A few hours later, the bridge was a flurry of activity, papers and screens cluttered with the finest bureaucratic gibberish humanity could muster. Hallie was in her element, spinning tales of interdepartmental procedures and cross-referenced authorizations that would make even the most seasoned government employee break out in a cold sweat. "Sending over the first set of documents now," Hallie said, fingers dancing over the console. "Let's see how they handle our special brand of red tape. Let's hope it ties them up in knots," Kincaid replied, glancing at Connors, who was busy scribbling notes and looking far too pleased with himself. "Consider this my magnum opus," Connors said, waving a particularly dense stack of papers. "I'm expecting an award for most illegible documentation." "Keep dreamin', Doc," Hallie teased. "This is more like a prank than an opus. Whatever it is, it better work," George chimed in, adjusting the power distribution controls with the nonchalance of someone who might just be adjusting the thermostat. A chime from Hallie's console interrupted the banter. "Incoming message from the V-Racks," she announced, her voice laced with anticipation. "Here goes nothing," Kincaid said, steeling himself for whatever alien confusion awaited them. Hallie patched through the communication, and the Virax envoy's holographic visage flickered into view. Its mandibles clicked as it surveyed them, likely trying to process the deluge of human bureaucracy that had just landed on its proverbial desk. "Human Captain," the Virax began, its tone as unreadable as its expression. "We have received your documents. Clarification required." Kincaid feigned ignorance with a shrug that could have won an award for insincerity. "Clarification? Well, you know how it is. Our systems are complex. It's all there in the files. Just a couple of processing stages and we'll be ready for your samples." The Virax stared, and Kincaid could almost hear the clinking gears of its alien brain machine grinding. "We find your processes inefficient. That's humans for you," Hallie cut in with a grin. "Can't live with us, can't understand our forms." Connors leaned over, whispering to Kincaid, "Think we've got them on the ropes, or they're just biding their time to eat us," Kincaid murmured back. The Virax finally spoke, its patience evidently wearing thin. "This inefficiency is counterproductive to our objectives. Expedite your procedures or we will take alternative measures." "Alternative measures?" Kincaid echoed, faking concern. "Oh, no need for that. We'll expedite." Just as soon as a loud clanking reverberated through the ship, making everyone wince. George frowned at his console, tapping a series of buttons to stabilize the power. "Just as soon as we tend to our little technical difficulties," Kincaid continued, his smile never wavering. "You understand, right? The perils of space travel." The Virax envoy's mandibles clicked in what Kincaid could only assume was frustration. "We shall await your compliance," it said, the hologram flickering out with a finality that was both satisfying and a little worrying. "Well, that went as well as could be expected," Hallie said, exhaling a breath she'd probably been holding for too long. "They're not buying it, but they're not rejecting it either," George observed. "We've bought ourselves some time to figure out a real plan," Connors added, "before they decide to expedite us into a fine mist." "Right," Kincaid said, rubbing his temples. "We need to keep them tangled in red tape while we figure out our next move." "Suggestions?" Hallie tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Maybe we can fabricate some more documents, make it look like we're about to hand over the most valuable tech they could dream of, or promise a demonstration of our advanced human defenses," Connors suggested. "We could use the old smoke and mirrors routine." "Sounds like a plan," Kincaid agreed. "We keep them looking one way while we slip out the back door." George shook his head, a rare smile creeping onto his face. "You know, this might just be the craziest thing we've ever done." "Desperate times, desperate measures," Hallie said with a wink. "And besides, what's life without a little chaos?" Their plan set, the crew dove back into the madness, concocting a fresh batch of documents that would make even the most hardened bureaucrat weep. It was a race against time, a battle of wits against an enemy that didn't understand the absurdity of human systems. As the hours passed, the Aegis continued its precarious dance around the rogue planet, lights flickering like a strobe light at a particularly depressing rave. The crew worked tirelessly, driven by the knowledge that failure meant giving the Virax exactly what they wanted, or worse, becoming their next pet project. With each passing hour, Kincaid's confidence grew, even as the ship groaned under the strain of its failing systems. If there was one thing humans excelled at, it was making the best of a bad situation. Finally, as they prepared to send off the latest batch of documents, Hallie sat back with a satisfied sigh. "All right, let's see how they like this." She initiated the transmission, and the crew waited in tense silence, the weight of their gamble hanging over them like an anvil on a fraying rope. Minutes stretched into an eternity before the Virax envoy's hologram reappeared, its mandibles clicking in a rhythm that might have been irritation. "Human Captain," it began, "your procedures are excessive." "Yeah, well, we're thorough like that," Kincaid replied, flashing a grin that was all teeth and no sincerity. "We wouldn't want to leave anything to chance." The Virax appeared to consider this, its many eyes narrowing slightly. "Our patience is not infinite." Expedite your compliance. Failure to do so will result in consequences. Consequences, Hallie echoed dryly. Always with the consequences. Relax, Kincaid said, his voice smooth as glass. We'll have everything ready soon. Just a few more steps in the process. The VRAX envoy's hologram flickered, as though the alien itself was struggling to maintain its composure. We shall hold you to that, human captain. With that, the hologram vanished, leaving the crew to their own devices once more. Well, that's one more round we've survived, Connors said, leaning back in his chair. Barely, George added, his eyes scanning the console for any new issues. Just means we're doing something right, Hallie said with a shrug. Or at least not entirely wrong. Kincaid nodded, the thrill of their success, or the closest thing to it, giving him a renewed sense of purpose. They'd bought themselves time, but they needed more than that to outmaneuver the VRAX. All right, team, he said, rallying them once more. We keep this up until we find a way out. We're not done yet. As they returned to their tasks, Kincaid allowed himself a moment of optimism, a rare luxury aboard the Aegis. The VRAX might have had them outgunned, but they hadn't reckoned with humanity's greatest weapon, the power of paperwork. If ever there was a time for hope, however faint, it was now. The Aegis shuddered, its groans echoing through the corridors like a dying whale with a sore throat. Kincaid brushed off a light shower of sparks from the overhead wiring, grimacing as he watched another panel blink out on the bridge. All right, team, looks like the ship's decided to express its opinion on our plan, he muttered, slapping the intercom with a grim satisfaction. Sloan, how's the engine room looking? Or is it more of a sauna these days? Sloan's voice crackled through the speaker, dripping pessimism like molasses. If by sauna you mean a fire hazard with delusions of grandeur, then yeah, it's a sauna. I've got systems failing faster than a cheap holo novel plot, comforting, Kincaid replied. Just keep us from exploding until we've finished dealing with the VRAX, all right. No promises, Sloan shot back, like a man who'd long since accepted his tragic fate. Kincaid turned his attention back to the bridge, where the crew was trying to herd the ship's technology into some semblance of obedience. George was hunched over the console, fiddling with a set of controls that seemed to take more pleasure in failing than functioning. Any chance we can get those power fluctuations under control? Kincaid asked, keeping his voice light despite the tension. George shrugged, his expression one of bemused resignation. If by control you mean they're only slightly less chaotic than our love lives, then sure. Otherwise, we're dancing on the edge of a blackout. Fantastic, Kincaid said dryly. How's the bureaucratic bombardment going, Hallie? Hallie's fingers flew over her console, her voice a studied monotone as she crafted yet another piece of red tape. We're sending them so many forms, they'll think they're being audited by the entire galaxy, which is exactly what we want, Connors added, a smirk on his face as he added his own artistic flourishes to their document dump. Death by paperwork. A chime interrupted their barely controlled chaos, signaling an incoming message. Hallie's face tightened, her expression a mix of anticipation and dread. It's the VRAX, she whispered, a hint of trepidation in her voice. Kincaid nodded, steeling himself. All right, let's see how they're handling the mountain of nonsense we've sent their way. The holographic form of the VRAX envoy flickered into existence, its alien features unreadable and cold. Kincaid straightened, adopting the facade of a man who had everything under control, even if the universe begged to differ. Human Captain, the VRAX began, its tone sharp enough to cut Durasteel. Your subterfuge has been detected. Kincaid's heart skipped a beat, but his expression remained infuriatingly bland. Subterfuge, he echoed, feigning confusion like a master thespian. We're just following standard procedures. Your deception is futile, the VRAX continued, its eyes narrowing with something akin to irritation. You will cease your delaying tactics immediately, or we will take control of your vessel. Take control. Kincaid repeated, his mind racing. Now hold on. There's no need to get hasty, but the VRAX wasn't listening. The hologram flickered out, leaving an ominous silence in its wake. "Looks like our bluff's been called," Hallie said, her voice tight. "What do we do now, O fearless leader?" Kincaid opened his mouth to respond, but any words of reassurance he might have offered were drowned out by the sudden, jarring lurch of the ship. The lights flickered madly, casting frantic shadows across the bridge. "George, what the hell's happening?" Kincaid barked, gripping the edge of his console for balance. "They're overriding our systems," George replied grimly, his fingers flying over the controls in a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control. "We're being locked out, shit," Kincaid muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Everyone, brace yourselves. We're in for a rough ride." The ship shuddered again, and the distant hum of unauthorized engines engaging echoed ominously through the halls. Sloane's voice crackled over the intercom, a lifeline in the chaos. "We've got VRAX signatures all over the main systems. They're trying to shut us down. Can you stop them?" Kincaid demanded, knowing full well the futility of the question. "Do I look like a miracle worker?" Sloane shot back, his sarcasm a thin veneer over genuine concern. "I'll try, but don't expect a miracle." The ship's descent into chaos continued unabated, systems failing like dominoes knocked over by an unruly child. Kincaid felt the sting of desperation clawing at the edges of his resolve, but he shoved it aside with practiced ease. Now was not the time for doubt. "Options," he called out, eyes flicking over his beleaguered crew. "We could surrender," George suggested, his tone a dry, rueful lament. "They might show mercy." Hallie snorted, her expression fierce. "And pigs might fly. The VRAX aren't exactly known for their benevolence." "Then we fight," Connors said, his voice steady and calm in the storm. "We lock down what we can and make it as hard as possible for them to take us out." Kincaid nodded, feeling a flicker of grim determination ignite in his chest. "All right, then. Let's make this the most annoying hijacking in history." He turned to Hallie, urgency in his gaze. "Can we scramble communication signals at least? Make it harder for them to coordinate." Hallie's fingers danced over the console, her expression one of fierce concentration. "I can throw up some interference, but it won't last forever." "Do it," Kincaid said. "Buy us some time." She nodded, her fingers a blur as she set to work. The ship's systems groaned in protest, but the faint hum of scrambled signals began to pulse through the air. "Sloane, sabotage what you can without blowing us all to hell," Kincaid ordered, hoping the engineers' natural pessimism would work in their favor. "Way ahead of you," Sloane replied, his voice crackling with static. "I'll make sure they regret picking our rust bucket. George, keep us from becoming space dust," Kincaid continued, his gaze steady despite the chaos. "Connors, with me. We're securing the armory." The medic rose from his seat, a grim smile on his face. "You know, I always wanted to go down swinging. Let's make sure it doesn't come to that," Kincaid replied, clapping him on the shoulder before leading the way out of the bridge. The corridors of the Aegis were a dizzying dance of chaos and disorder, but the crew moved with purpose, driven by the specter of defeat. As they reached the armory, Kincaid's eyes swept over the meager collection of weaponry with a critical eye. "Not exactly the arsenal of legends, but it'll have to do." Connors chuckled, grabbing a pulse rifle and checking its charge. "Never thought I'd miss the days when I was just patching up hangovers. Life's full of surprises," Kincaid said, slinging a rifle over his shoulder. "Let's make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." With their preparations made, and a plan if it could be called that, in motion, Kincaid and Connors made their way back towards the bridge, the weight of their circumstances pressing down on them like a leaden cloak. They arrived to find Hallie and George locked in a tense dance with the ship's systems, trying to outmaneuver the VRAX's control. The lights above flickered like the world's most depressing disco, casting the scene in a surreal glow. "We've got interference up, but it's only a matter of time," Hallie said, her voice tight with concentration. "Then we make sure that time counts," Kincaid replied, setting his rifle within easy reach and taking his place at the helm. George glanced up, his expression a study in grim determination. "Last chance to turn back, you know. Not my style," Kincaid said, his eyes fixed on the console. "Let's see if we can make this ship dance." The Virax might have had their claws in the Aegis, but Kincaid was damned if he'd let them take it without a fight. The ship was more than just metal and wires. It was home, and it was worth the battle. As the minutes stretched into an eternity, the crew worked in silence, each focused on their tasks with a precision born of necessity. The Virax's hold on the ship was a choking grip, but the crew fought back with every ounce of stubbornness they possessed. And slowly, incrementally, the tide began to turn. Systems flickered back to life, even as others faltered, the ship's spirit undimmed by the onslaught. "Looks like we're making some headway," George said, a note of hope threading through his voice. "Don't jinx it," Hallie replied, though a smile teased at the corners of her mouth. "We'll need more than luck to see this through," Connors added, his gaze steady and sure. Kincaid nodded, feeling the weight of their struggle give way to a fierce, stubborn hope. They might be outmatched, but they weren't out yet. Not by a long shot. "All right, team," he said, his voice ringing out over the bridge. "Let's show these Virax bastards what it means to mess with humans." With renewed determination, they threw themselves back into the fray, each minute bringing them closer to a victory they refused to let slip from their grasp. It was a desperate gamble, but in space, as in life, sometimes that was all you had. And sometimes, just sometimes, it was enough. Tessalyn Price had a knack for sticking her nose where it didn't belong, mostly because she had nothing better to do on the Aegis, and the alternative was counting ceiling tiles. She'd been sort of the ship's unofficial investigator of weirdness, a title she gave herself one afternoon when the gravity went out, and she floated into a room labeled "Do Not Enter." There, she accidentally uncovered George's stash of vintage erotica magazines. She figured if she could find that, surely she could find something useful now. With the ship teetering on the edge of becoming a Virax plaything, Tess was reminding herself of that bit of optimism as she sifted through digital debris on a terminal. The Virax may have locked them out of most systems, but they'd been sloppy, leaving behind a trail of documents in their wake, likely thinking the humans too busy saving their own necks to bother reading. Tess squinted at the screen, her eyes flicking over the alien glyphs with the fervor of someone who'd spent way too many Saturday nights playing interstellar escape room games. And there it was, a peculiar document with a Virax seal that looked like a bureaucrat's fever dream. "Well, hello there," she muttered, her fingers dancing over the console. The document was dense, like trying to read a phone book printed in Klingon, but Tessalyn was in her element. She had a knack for languages and a love for puzzles that made her perfect for this sort of work. Hours spent locked in her room watching alien soap operas to hone her skills were finally paying off. "Tess, you in here?" Commander Zephyr Kincaid appeared at the doorway, his face a mask of exhaustion and determination. "We're about 2 hiccups away from being completely screwed. You got anything?" Tess grinned, that wild-eyed look she always got when she was onto something flaring brightly. "Oh, you're gonna love this, boss." The Virax's obsession with protocol might just be their Achilles heel. Kincaid raised an eyebrow, stepping into the cramped space Tessalyn had claimed. "Achilles what now?" "It means they are sticklers for rules. Every little regulation has to be followed to the letter. If we can find even a minor inconsistency or loophole, we could use it against them." Kincaid's interest peaked, a flicker of hope breaking through the grimness of the day. "So, we're gonna drown them in their own red tape." "Exactly," Tess nodded, her fingers flying over the console. "It's like fighting a bureaucratic dragon with its own tail." Kincaid chuckled, the sound more breath than voice but genuine nonetheless. "Let's hope their love of rules outweighs their appetite for taking over ships. Keep digging, Tess. We need all the ammo we can get." As Kincaid returned to the bridge, Tess dove back into the data. Each line of text was another piece of the puzzle, and she was determined to make it fit. There was something oddly comforting about the predictability of Virax bureaucracy. It had a rhythm, a cadence. For creatures so consumed by conquest, they were almost charming in their monotonous obsession with regulation. Meanwhile, back on the bridge, Connors was trying to maintain some semblance of sanity. "So, we're relying on the alien equivalent of a tax code to save us?" he asked, disbelief laced through his words. "Seems like it," George replied, his eyes still glued to his console. "I've heard of fighting fire with fire, but fighting bureaucracy with bureaucracy, that's a new one. Just our luck we'd end up against the universe's most anal-retentive aliens," Hallie chimed in, not looking up from her work. "If they spend as much time on effective invasion strategies as they do on their paperwork, we'd be toast." "Good thing they didn't then," Kincaid said, rejoining the fray. "The Virax might be good at a lot of things, but thinking outside the box doesn't seem to be one of them." The ship shook again, another salvo in the Virax's attempts to disable them. But this time Kincaid wasn't as worried. They had a sliver of hope, a tiny crack in the Virax's armor they could exploit. "Sloan, how's the sabotage going?" Kincaid asked, tapping the intercom. Like trying to knit a sweater with spaghetti, Sloan's voice crackled over the line. "I've got a few surprises rigged, but we're one wrong move away from a very permanent vacation. Do what you can." "We've got another angle working, thanks to Tess. Bureaucratic warfare, if you can believe it." "I'll hold onto my hat then," Sloan replied dryly. "And my skepticism." Back in her corner, Tessalin was making headway. The document's labyrinthine structure began to unravel under her scrutiny. She found clauses and subsections that made less sense than a quantum physics lecture at a toddler's birthday party. Her breakthrough came when she stumbled upon a clause about biological sample protection. According to the document, any biological entities on board, read, the crew, had protections under Virax protocol. Something about maintaining ecosystem diversity. Bureaucratic nonsense to the rescue. Tessalin practically leapt out of her seat, sprinting back to the bridge with the fervor of a convert who'd just seen the face of their deity in a grilled cheese sandwich. "Guys, I've got it," she exclaimed, bursting onto the bridge and startling the rest of the crew. "Got what?" Kincaid asked, looking up from his console, where he'd been attempting to keep the ship from falling apart with nothing more than hope and duct tape. Tessalin was nearly vibrating with excitement. "The Virax can't touch us, at least not without violating their own rules." "Come again," George said, skepticism painting his words. "There's a clause in their protocol about biological sample protection. They can't destroy or harm us without breaking their own rules. It's like a galactic safety net." Hallie's eyes widened. "So, we're not just useless meatbags to them. We're protected meatbags." "Exactly." Tessalin beamed, feeling like she just solved a crossword puzzle no one else even realized existed. "So what, we just sit back and wait for them to figure out they're breaking their own rules?" Connors asked, his tone caught between hope and disbelief. "More like we shove it in their faces," Tessalin replied, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. "We've got to make them realize breaking protocol is more trouble than it's worth." Kincaid nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. "Hallie, you think you can craft a message to the Virax that'll make them second-guess their actions? Emphasize the legal consequences and all that jazz." Hallie's expression turned crafty, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "Oh, I can make it sound like they'll be drowning in forms and inquiries if they mess with us. Bureaucracy is my second language." "Then let's get to it," Kincaid said, feeling the weight of their situation lessen just a bit. "If they want to play games with rules and regulations, we'll make sure they regret underestimating us." The bridge buzzed with renewed energy as Hallie began drafting their message, each keystroke a calculated piece of verbal warfare. Tessalin returned to her station, prepared to dig up any more useful tidbits she could find. The rest of the crew, while still on edge, found a strange sense of camaraderie in their shared goal. It was them against the Virax, and they'd be damned if they'd go down without a fight. George continued monitoring the system, keeping a watchful eye on power levels and any flicker of Virax interference. "It's like trying to keep a sieve from leaking," he muttered, adjusting settings and rerouting power where he could. Sloan, down in engineering, was busy making life difficult for any VRACs who dared step foot on the ship. He'd rigged the engines to backfire, the gravity to fluctuate, and even the air conditioning to blast ice-cold air at strategic intervals. If they were going to be taken, it wouldn't be without giving the alien invaders a literal and figurative chill. They might have the upper hand, Connors said, tightening his grip on his rifle, but we've got the chaos factor. Chaos is one thing we've always been good at, Kincaid agreed, his eyes locked on the view ahead. Let's see if they can handle it. As the minutes ticked by, the ship systems continued their jittery dance, but there was a newfound sense of optimism among the crew. The VRACs might have underappreciated the lengths to which desperate humans would go to survive. They thought they were dealing with a fractured crew and a broken ship, but they were wrong. Hallie's fingers paused over the console, a final flourish marking the end of her message. Ready to send this bombshell, do it, Kincaid said, a grim smile on his lips. With a final tap, Hallie sent the message, a digital middle finger wrapped up in polite alien jargon. It was a shot in the dark, but it was the best they had. The minutes stretched, each filled with the quiet hum of tension and anticipation. The crew held their breath, waiting for the VRAC's response, knowing it could make or break their situation. The intercom crackled to life, and the familiar, clipped tones of the VRAC's envoy filled the bridge once more. Human Captain, you have cited a breach in protocol. This matter will require re-evaluation. Kincaid couldn't help but smirk. He'd seen politicians in corporate suits bend over backward for a loophole. It seemed the VRACs weren't any different. Re-evaluation, huh? Connors said, a chuckle escaping his lips. Didn't think we'd ever see the day. Just goes to show, George added, you can never underestimate the power of paperwork. As the line went silent, the crew allowed themselves a moment of relief, the weight of their predicament lifting slightly. The VRACs might be a formidable force, but they had their own Achilles heel, one the crew of the Aegis was more than willing to exploit. We're not out of the woods yet, Hallie warned, though her voice was lighter than it had been in days. But we're getting there, Kincaid replied, a note of confidence returning to his tone. We've bought ourselves some time, and that's more than we had before. The crew settled back into their stations, a renewed sense of purpose driving them forward. They were still very much in the thick of it, but they had an advantage now, a small one, but an advantage nonetheless. Tessalin continued her search, determined to uncover anything else that might help them. The bureaucracy of the VRACs was a labyrinth of rules, but she was more than willing to navigate its twists and turns. And as the Aegis continued its precarious dance in the void, the crew knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't go down without a fight. Not when there was a chance, however slim, of turning the tables on their would-be conquerors. They were humans, after all, stubborn, irreverent, and clever to a fault, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As another rumble shook the ship, Kincaid grinned, feeling the fire of defiance burn bright. All right, team. Let's keep these bastards on their toes. The cosmos stretched before them, a vast, unyielding frontier. And for the crew of the Aegis, it was a battlefield worth fighting for. The Aegis groaned like a hungover giant as it limped through space, every creak and shudder a testament to its desire to throw in the towel and call it a day. Commander Zephyr Kincaid, however, couldn't afford the luxury of a collapse. Not now, not when Tessalin's legal voodoo had thrown the VRACs off their game. You ever think we'd be saved by a clause in an intergalactic Better Homes and Gardens manual? Kincaid grunted, watching the stars smear past like someone had smeared Vaseline on the universe. Hallie Pritchard snorted from her station, fingers flying over keys like she was trying to outrun her own thoughts. Honestly, I thought our best bet was hoping they'd choke on their own self-righteousness, or find out allergic to the color beige, Connors added, eyebrows raised in that way he had when he was about to administer dark humor like a healing balm. That's about all we've got decorating this tin can, Tessalin, their unexpected savior and connoisseur of arcane alien laws, was knee-deep in another pile of VRAX documentation. Alien soap operas had nothing on this. The drama, the betrayal, the sheer audacity of paperwork. It was a whole other level of masochism. Found another one, she announced, waving a worn data tablet like it was a winning lottery ticket. Subsection 32, paragraph 9.2. They are not allowed to engage in hostile actions without a 3-day grace period for environmental reassessment, so we can delay their plans with red tape. Hallie's eyes gleamed with the thrill of giving those bureaucratic bastards a taste of their own medicine. I'm starting to like these guys, yeah. If they weren't trying to kill us, we'd have a lot to talk about over a really awkward dinner, Kincaid agreed. The ship jolted as Sloane's latest sabotage effort kicked in. Somewhere deep in the bowels of the Aegis, an engine belched in protest, spewing nonsense data back at the VRAX trying to hack them. The engineer's voice crackled over the intercom, sounding like he was grinning from ear to ear. Who knew breaking stuff could be so damn satisfying? You're a terror with a spanner, Sloane, Kincaid replied, and Sloane's chuckle was faint but filled with a grim satisfaction. Tessalin scribbled furiously on a piece of outdated paper, because digital wasn't dramatic enough when you were throwing alien protocols in their faces, and handed it to Hallie. This should do it. Make sure you really emphasize the consequences. You know, like total systemic audit and a fate worse than death by filing cabinet. Hallie's grin was sharper than a vibro blade. Oh, I'll make sure they feel the terror of the potential audit down to their very cores. She typed with a flourish, her words a litany of legal threats and procedural nightmares. Kincaid watched, a feeling of pride welling up in his chest despite everything. I always knew we'd save the day with paperwork, he mused, sarcasm dripping from his voice like acid rain. Better than the alternative, Connors said, gesturing vaguely to the void beyond the viewports. Which is, you know, getting vaporized. Vaporization is bad for my complexion. George piped up from his station, eyes still glued to his console like a moth to a particularly boring flame. He was the guy you went to for a pulse on the ship's vitals, even if he was more interested in a stash of vintage erotica magazines than interstellar crises. Hallie sent their bureaucratic bombshell to the VRAX, the digital equivalent of a courtroom drama, where the humans played the unexpected ace in this cosmic poker game. And now we wait. The minutes ticked by, each second stretched thin by the tension hanging in the air. If they had nails left, they'd have been bitten down to stubs. If they had nerve endings that hadn't already been fried by stress, they'd have been fraying. The intercom flared to life once more, the VRAX envoy's voice a model of clipped frustration. Human Captain, your documentation has been received. Our governance is involved in reassessment, read. They are stuck in the mother of all meetings, Connors chuckled, a sound that was more a bark of disbelief. Ah, the universe's great equalizer. The meeting, Kincaid agreed, a wolfish grin splitting his face. I didn't think we'd ever find something as universally hated. As they waited for the VRAX to untangle themselves from their own red tape, Kincaid looked around at his crew. A ragtag bunch, each more flawed than the next, but resourceful enough to turn an alien invasion into a bureaucratic nightmare. Not bad for a day's work. All right, Kincaid declared, let's keep the momentum going. George, keep an eye on systems. Hallie, keep those legal grenades ready. Tess, see if you can dig up any more helpful clauses. If they want a paperwork war, we'll give them the full office experience. Complete with passive-aggressive memos and fresh hell in triplicate, Tessalin added, flipping through another set of VRAX documents with the enthusiasm of someone searching for a needle in a haystack made of red tape. As the crew settled back into their tasks, the ship shuddered again, a reminder that their problems were far from over. Sloane's voice broke through the intercom with a note of smug satisfaction. Just fired up the gravity glitch. Hope those VRAX have strong stomachs. They're gonna need them, Kincaid replied. And if this all falls through, we'll have to hope their bureaucracy isn't as strong as their stomachs. The minutes stretched into hours, the crew hanging in a balance of tense anticipation and grim humor. The Aegis was still a mess, but there was a strange sense of camaraderie, a shared purpose that held them together. "Hey, Kincaid," Hallie called, "if this works, maybe we should start a consultancy. How to win intergalactic battles with paperwork. I'll stick to command, thanks," Kincaid chuckled. "Besides, I'm not sure our nerves could handle another round of this." Finally, the intercom crackled back to life. The Virax envoy, sounding more harried than ever, addressed them with an air of reluctant respect. "Human Captain, we acknowledge your documentation. Your presence requires further analysis. We are ordered to retreat temporarily." A cheer went up from the crew, the relief palpable as they realized they'd done it. The Virax were retreating, forced into a stalemate by the unlikeliest of weapons: bureaucracy. "Holy hell, it actually worked," Connors said, shaking his head in disbelief. "We beat them with paperwork. Who knew that drowning them in forms would be our saving grace?" George added, disbelief still evident in his tone. Kincaid allowed himself a moment of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. "We won this round, folks. But let's not get too comfortable. They'll be back and we'll need to be ready with more forms," Tesselin quipped, feeling the high of their unlikely victory. "And maybe a few more surprises." The crew of the Aegis knew they'd won a battle, but not the war. Yet for now, they'd celebrate their victory, however fleeting it might be. They'd outmaneuvered a technologically superior foe with nothing but wit, creativity, and a mountain of paperwork. "All right, people," Kincaid said, "we've got breathing room. Let's make the most of it and get this ship back in shape. We might not have saved the universe, but we've saved ourselves, and that's a damn fine start." As the Aegis limped away from the rogue planet, its crew busy repairing, regrouping, and of course, laughing at the absurdity of it all, they knew they'd stand ready for whatever the universe threw their way. For now, they'd rest easy knowing they'd given the Virax a bureaucratic battle to remember. The cosmos might be vast and unforgiving, but in this corner of it, the humans had claimed a small, snarky victory. And that was worth a toast, or at least a wry grin shared among friends who'd beaten the odds once again. The Aegis was still making noises like someone had fired a shotgun into a bag of walnuts, but that was okay. The crew had beaten back the Virax, and if they were lucky, they could patch enough of the ship up to avoid being sucked out into the void. Considering the state of things, not getting sucked out into the void had become something of a gold standard. Kincaid stood on the bridge, looking less like the valiant captain of a spacefaring vessel and more like a man who just discovered last night's kebab had gone rogue in his fridge. The bridge buzzed around him, mostly with the sound of Hallie cursing at uncooperative technology. "You know, if this console were any more glitchy, it'd be moonlighting as a glitch in a video game. Think you could sweet-talk it into working?" Kincaid suggested, arms folded across his chest in a parody of a gracious host. "Sweet talk. I'd have better luck convincing it to join a cult," Hallie shot back, her fingers dancing over the keys like they were the key to salvation, or at least not dying in a cold, empty void. Connors sauntered in, a fresh bandage on his arm from a minor collision with a piece of rogue tech. "What's the word, fearless leader? Are we hobbling away from this rock, or are we growing roots?" "We're making it work," Kincaid replied, as if the ship wasn't one misstep away from joining the cosmic scrap heap. "Good to know," Connors nodded, as if he hadn't seen the Aegis in a state that could only be called barely holding together with cosmic duct tape and the power of positive thinking. "Because I'm running low on my rather limited supply of medical supplies, and I'm tired of treating wounds with a combination of sarcasm and hope. Hope's the most potent medicine we've got these days," Kincaid quipped. "And hey, sarcasm's free." Over at her station, Tesselin was peeling through another mound of Virax documents, the text as dense as a neutron star and twice as fun. "You'd think with all their advanced tech they'd have figured out how to make this stuff less of a snooze fest. I guess some things are universal, Hallie shrugged. Like bureaucratic documents and bad pop music. George, still engrossed in his console, chimed in without looking up. And catastrophically outdated porn collections. The ship groaned again, adding its 2 cents to the conversation, and Kincaid decided it was time to take stock. All right, status report. How soon can we be spaceborne? Hallie looked at him, her expression one of grim determination mixed with a dash of mischief. We're looking at a few more hours, provided this hunk of metal doesn't decide to up and die on us mid-repair. Great. I'll pencil in not dying for later this afternoon, Kincaid said, rubbing the back of his neck like it might help him forget the sheer volume of problems stacked up like a cosmic game of Jenga. Sloane's voice crackled over the intercom, sounding both triumphant and just a little too pleased. Gravity glitch is holding, but I wouldn't trust it as far as I could throw the Virax's ego. Understood, Sloane. Keep those engines from belching us into space, will you? Kincaid replied, not for the first time wondering how exactly they'd ended up with an engineer who treated sabotage as a recreational sport. We'll be good to go, Sloane said, with the confidence of a man who had a slightly unhealthy relationship with making things go boom. Good, Kincaid replied, turning back to his crew with a wry smile. Because the last thing I want to do is explain to command how we became an asteroid's hood ornament. The intercom clicked off, and Hallie let out an exaggerated sigh. We should have negotiated for hazard pay. No amount of money's worth this, Connors said dryly. But at least we've got each other. Misery loves company after all. But does it come with dental? Tessalin asked, finally looking up from her terminal with a tired grin. Only if you count pulling your own teeth with pliers, Connors replied, his dark humor a familiar balm. With grim determination and a sprinkling of humor, the crew of the Aegis set to work. George, mumbling something about parts and systems, wandered off to ensure the ship's vitals were at least pretending to cooperate. Hallie kept at the console, her fingers dancing like a pianist at the height of a particularly chaotic concerto. The others busied themselves with repairs, each in their own little bubble of frantic activity. As the hours dragged on, a sense of camaraderie filled the air, tinged with the kind of hope that comes from realizing you've cheated death once more. Even the ship seemed to settle, its protestations turning into a resigned hum as the crew coaxed it back into something resembling operational status. All right, Kincaid called, wiping a smudge of grease from his brow and standing back to admire the patchwork of repairs. We've got to get off this rock. The crew gathered on the bridge, a motley collection of survivors held together by duct tape, luck, and a shared sense of humor darker than the void outside. Tessalin, data tablet in hand, stood next to Hallie, who still had a determined glint in her eyes. We've got enough juice to break orbit, Hallie reported, though I'd keep an eye out for any more Virax surprises. They're like space herpes. Just when you think they're gone, they pop back up. Charming as always, Hallie, Connors deadpanned. But I'll take that over getting vaporized any day. Kincaid nodded, his expression a blend of determination and that ever-present hint of sarcasm. All right, folks, let's get this show on the road. As the Aegis powered up, the ship seemed to sigh with relief. It wasn't the most graceful departure in the universe, but it was a departure all the same. The engines thrummed and the rogue planet shrank in the viewport. Kincaid took a deep breath. Here's to leaving our problems behind. Yeah, because we definitely won't find any more out there, Hallie added, her voice dripping with irony. Tessalin shot her a wry smile. Maybe we'll stumble across a planet made entirely of chocolate or something equally unlikely. Only if we get really, really unlucky, George said, finally tearing his eyes from his console to join in the banter. And if we do, Connors said, raising an imaginary glass, here's to hoping the chocolate's dark. Just like the universe. As laughter filled the bridge, the Aegis moved away from the planet, leaving their recent escapades behind. The crew had won a small victory, and in the grand scheme of things, that was enough. They'd live to fight another day, armed with humor, paperwork, and a healthy dose of irreverence. Kincaid leaned back in his chair, feeling a strange sense of peace. It wouldn't last, of course. Nothing ever did, but it was enough for now. All right, folks, let's see what the universe throws at us next. Probably more VRACs, Hallie said, rolling her eyes. Or something worse. But whatever it is, Tesselin added with a grin, I'm sure we'll find a way to turn it into a bureaucratic mess before it kills us. Or die trying, George said, though a hint of optimism colored his words. As the Aegis cruised through space, its crew braced for whatever came next. They were battered, bruised, and weary, but they were also unbowed, ready to face whatever madness awaited them in the great dark unknown. In a universe filled with uncertainty, one thing was for sure. The crew of the Aegis would continue to defy the odds, armed with their wits, their humor, and a healthy disregard for the impossible. And so on they went into the void with a shrug and a smile. Because when you're human and you've got nothing left to lose, sometimes all you can do is laugh in the face of the cosmos and carry on.